Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar, Innovation in Repeatable Low-Rise Housing. My name is Shalika Sivathasan, and I am the Administrative Assistant in the Continuing Education Department at the OAA. We will begin today's webinar by acknowledging the land on which we are meeting and calling in from. For millennia, the place we call Ontario has been inhabited by Indigenous peoples and nations who have been stewards of the land and who are deeply connected to its rich cultural and natural landscape. We would like to invite you in a moment of reflection to acknowledge our shared responsibility to address past and present injustices and provide space for Indigenous knowledge and worldviews to shape the architectural landscape of Turtle Island. Before we begin, I would like to share some important information to ensure an effective and professional webinar experience. Please be informed that this session is being recorded for quality and educational purposes. For accessibility, we provide automated closed captioning service available in multiple languages to accommodate the needs of our diverse audience. In order to maintain a stable internet connection, we have muted all participant microphones and disabled video feeds. Kindly note the chat function has also been deactivated. However, we do highly encourage engagement through our Q&A window, which you will find at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to submit any questions that you may have for our speaker there, and the questions will be addressed during the designated question and answer period at the end of the presentation. For those seeking continuing education learning hours, please note that attendance is crucial. A minimum of 80% attendance is required for these hours to be accredited to your OAA transcript. Please just allow a few weeks for the processing and reporting of these hours. And lastly, please note that the presenter does not provide insurance, legal, or practice advice, and that the OAA does not bear any responsibility for errors or omissions in discussions during the webinar. Now, I am very excited to introduce our speaker for today's session. Please welcome Rosaline Hill.
Hi, thank you. I'm happy to be here. I'm an architect and an urban planner. I live and work in Ottawa. I have a practice that provides architectural and planning services primarily to developer clients and primarily on infill housing. Though, as you'll see as my presentation unfolds, we do also work for municipalities, providing them with urban growth management planning services. So I've been working in the infill housing niche for a couple of decades now. I have a team of architects and technologists who are really fantastic at this little niche, which, as many of you probably know, is a lot more complicated than it looks. So we're going to talk today about innovation in repeatable low-rise housing. And I come into this challenge from the perspective of somebody who's been working in the infill niche for quite a while, but also from the business perspective of my clients. So many of you may share a business model that also includes understanding your client's business model. When it comes to infill housing development, making the numbers work is key. So projects only move ahead when the business model really works. And so at core to all of my work on infill and missing middle housing is this kind of site study analysis, understanding exactly what's possible on a site given the regulations and the constraints of building codes and market demands, to give clients a true understanding of the highest and best use of any piece of land. Other aspects of my work that are really relevant here. A couple of years ago, I became a semi-finalist in the 5th round of the CMHC Housing Supply Challenge and was able, with that support, to take previous research that had been undertaken in my office around development patterns of infill and growth management patterns, and expand that research and retool it into programming that we could offer to municipalities to help them to understand their options for growth management through infill housing, to forecast outcomes and really understand the mechanics of choice that developers make in what they're going to build and not build. We've also been working on some prototype designs for a higher density, so mid-density infill low-rise housing, and working in municipalities consulting with residents about what it would mean for infill housing to really make their neighborhoods better. That work has brought us into collaboration with all sorts of different lovely groups of people. So many of them listed here, varied expertise in affordable housing, neighborhood transition, pre-manufactured elements, so volumetric and panelized modular. We have always been very connected to our housing association, our local housing association, and that continues to be really important in our ongoing work and research and understanding of this niche. SSG has been helping us with emissions modeling so that we can understand the impacts of infill choices on emissions outcomes. Focus Consulting has been helping us understand the bigger picture housing policy, and yeah, the list goes on. So the innovation in repeatable low-rise housing. Let's just start by breaking that down a little bit. When we think about innovation, it can mean so many different things. And I'm not going to be talking to you about 3D printed infill houses. There are all different ways in which low-rise housing has been repeated throughout history. And it's important for us to challenge ourselves and think about what really does innovation mean right now in this moment of history, in this moment of housing crisis. And when we think about innovations, what innovation is and the significance of innovation, I think it's always good to remind ourselves of some of the little innovations around us in our daily life that are so significant, like Velcro, replacing buttons and zips, the chocolate that melts in your mouth and on your hand, little things like the paperclip. These things have been life-changing innovations, and life-changing in varying degrees. But it's that kind of smart thinking that I want to draw our attention to today when we think about innovation. When we think about replication, repeatability in this housing niche, there are a lot of different aspects of repeatable that we need to keep in mind. So we can repeat buildings, we can repeat pieces of buildings, and we can also be repeating with a kind of kit of parts approach to repetition. And then lastly, my title, low-rise housing. Why is low-rise so important? This is a little pie chart showing how Canadians live right now. So almost 17% in mid and high-rise, 12.5% in low-rise rural, and then the vast majority, over 70% of us, live in low-rise dwellings in urban areas. So is obviously the biggest piece of the pie. It's really important. We hear a lot of talk from the federal government about housing and housing solutions, and not an awful lot of focus, I don't think, on this low-rise urban piece that's really essential. My slides are slow. Sorry about that. Okay. So innovation in repeatable low-rise housing. I put this list together because I feel that this is a list of fabulous things that I would like to come to fruition in order for this niche to be really great. So lower household emissions without added cost, lower household costs, lower maintenance and maintenance costs. It would be fantastic for these homes to all be in convenient locations. It would be great to have a diverse unit mix and a diversity of tenures, and for these homes to be in really great contexts. This would be innovative. Right now, first of all, we're not getting much housing. we're paying quite a bit for our emissions reductions. We have improved fairly with lower maintenance, but everybody has very busy lives. This checklist for me is just like this would be the goal. This would be great. So you can see my focus isn't on the bells and whistles, but really at the core of what would make this housing great in the most practical sense. And we're going to talk about these things and how we can achieve all of these things. But when we look, and as we go through, we'll look at this mid-density infill niche, how it works out with that innovation checklist, talk about the complexities and barriers to that niche, and what it means to move forward with this kind of housing from the perspective of architects working in this industry. So, low-rise multi-unit housing is fundamentally very emissions smart. Because when we share walls, floors, and ceilings, it's better than insulation, right? So fundamentally a very affordable way to reduce emissions. Also, infill is generally located in older neighborhoods across Canada. Those older neighborhoods are well located and result in lower kilometers driven. So we're already ticking boxes on our list here. When we have multiple units in a building, shared roofs and foundations, lower maintenance costs. These kinds of buildings can be designed, and almost inevitably, the business models work out well with a diversity of unit types. Diversity of tenures depends on different provinces across the country, but there's certainly the opportunity for rental units, ownership, and condominium structures. Obviously, the condo market is a little constrained right now by the market. So let's talk about where infill lands in Canada within our municipalities, because of course infill doesn't go everywhere. It doesn't belong everywhere. The business model doesn't work everywhere. It works well in older neighborhoods, and so some of them are mapped out here. You see a variety, 3 different size cities. The maps are colored only showing low-rise neighborhoods. So the maps are not highlighting with color any of the areas that are high-rise or industrial, et cetera, just low-rise neighborhoods. And you'll see on the right, on the legend, these older neighborhoods are typically of very low densities. So if we mapped right across the country, these older neighborhoods, you'd just see an awful lot of yellow. And that low density, all of that yellow, represents parts of municipalities that are cost prohibitive, that are a cost drain on their municipalities, in that the tax base that the taxes paid by residents in those areas isn't enough to cover the ongoing cost of municipal services to those areas. So though we love our older neighborhoods, there is something at the heart of them that's just fundamentally not working. So our neighborhoods look something like this. These are just some examples. Quite a bit of variety. What they share in common, though, mostly rectangular lots. The lot sizes are actually quite consistent. So there's not a wild variety here, based or as a result of early British surveying of urban areas. And pre-1980, an awful lot of homes that are older with low levels of insulation, many built quite poorly and ready for replacement. All of these similarities lend themselves to the idea of a repeatable solution for infill. We take a look at a little sample of one of these neighborhoods. This sample street was created with homes from Vanier in Ottawa. Obviously very low density, not a great mix of unit types. Infill could allow a doubling of density, as you see here on the screen, without losing the character of the street. So we've replaced a couple of buildings, a few new sixplexes and a triplex, and that has doubled the density. When we think about the significance of that, the density by lot is different than the average density of the neighborhood. And so what's significant here is that some mid-density redevelopment was inserted into the street. But overall, that increases the density of the neighborhood in a way that is significant and important for the municipality, because it means that the tax base is much more solid in this neighborhood, and the municipality can actually afford to keep the neighborhood in good shape. So one of the things that my firm has been doing for municipalities is mapping infill outcomes. Most municipal planners think that it's just a mystery. You just have to wait and see. But in fact, you don't have to wait and see what the housing industry will do. If there is profit to be made, someone will build it. And so by understanding the business model of our clients, we can forecast outcomes. And using GIS, we map those outcomes and project them forward over time. So this is an example in Almont, the older neighborhoods of the town of Almont near Ottawa, a growth projection over 20 years based on some recommended regulatory changes that would allow for these small multi-unit buildings. This is a projection of the emissions reductions that would result from that intensification. So on the left, sort of a placeholder map for emissions today, and on the right, the reduction in emissions on average per household as a result of that intensification. So the majority of the homes have stayed exactly as they are, but about 1% of them have been replaced each year over time, so that over 20 years, there's an influx of these buildings with much better insulation. And it's overall, on average, reduced the average emissions per household quite significantly. So the work that we do with municipalities out of my office, we do under the banner of Building In. This is one of our marketing images showing that high proportion of people living in low rise of some kind compared to mid and high rise, and that really valuable housing opportunity in the middle, for which architects really need to step up with some innovative solutions. So we have been designing for quite some time, many of us, infill projects like the one in the middle here, two dwelling units. So that's a semi. This design is actually out of my office, and it has been constructed in Westboro. And the image on the right is another design from my office. This is a prototype we've designed for Moncton, and it's an 8-unit dwelling. It's the same size building. In the neighborhood context, they have the same impact. The building on the right has a dramatic increase in density and is a huge advantage fiscally to that street from a municipal perspective, and lends to that average reduction in emissions for the street. The multi-unit niche of 4 to 12 units is a huge opportunity because it provides that mid-density influx into the neighborhood without changing the overall character of the neighborhood. Neighborhood parking is a really key piece, though, of this puzzle. So these kinds of higher densities can only be achieved without on-site parking. And I'm going to come back to that because, of course, when you don't have on-site parking, you often have a problem with the business model for redevelopment unless there's another parking solution nearby. So here's a simple SketchUp streetscape showing what double the density looks like in a neighborhood. So the colored building on the right is an added 9-plex in this context. And of all the buildings you can see within view, this constitutes a doubling of density. So for those of us who work in infill, that's not a huge surprise. But when I show this image to municipal planners and policymakers, they're often quite surprised that this is what double the density could mean for a community, because it's not that visually significant a change. That's just a quick look at what those 8 units look like in plan. 3-bedroom units on the top floor, 2-bedroom, 2-story units facing the street, and facing the rear yard for 1-bedroom units. Some other examples of buildings in this niche. This one is a 6-plex at the front, so a triplex and a triplex, and then townhouses attached at the back. Obviously, the style is up for grabs. There's lots of different styles that could be applied to this basic structure. There's some plans showing you what that would look like. So in the front, 3 stories, a half basement with 1-bedroom units, 1 bedrooms on the ground floor, 1 bedrooms on the floor, all at the front facing the street, and then more typical townhouse design running along the depth of this particularly deep lot. Another example is a front to back. So 3 units at the front facing the street, 3 units at the back with an entrance at the front on a porch, entrance at the back on the porch, and along the side yard, 4 entry doors. So they're just out of sight, just down here. Those are all 2-story examples. There are lots of 3-story examples as well. The 3-story examples do lend themselves to shared entrances and exits, as opposed to dedicated entrances and exits, one for each unit. This is an image from RJH Architectural Partners. They've done some work on single stair access buildings, and these also can be innovative in as infill in our older neighborhoods. Some of these examples are better suited to busier streets rather than in the hearts of older neighborhoods, but single stairs certainly can lend themselves to the neighborhood context as well. Just to be clear, when we think about neighborhood intensification, and that the vast amount of low density neighborhoods across Canada, this is the kind of change that we're looking at. So this incremental change throughout neighborhood fabric that has so much potential to house so many Canadians. This is the kind of change that reaps those significant and almost free emissions reductions, that lowers household costs because those units are much more affordable and in affordable locations. Often households live with a lower car ownership. This achieves the lower maintenance. Also is an opportunity for these neighborhoods to change for the better, right? To receive funding and to be improved, to attract small shops and businesses. So in the end, following a wave of intensification, we actually even can achieve the final bullet point on my wish list, which is a desirable local context. Some of our older neighborhoods are already desirable. Some are a bit shabby and could really use a bit of an upgrade and attract some newer developments and small shops to walk to. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about how it is that we as architects work to get these kinds of buildings built, and the challenges that we face when we take on this kind of new innovative format for housing. Getting housing development off the ground is a real puzzle. Lots of pieces. so many factors involved in choosing a development that is going to be a success, and in designing a good building for our clients. We are, as architects, are the professionals who have our fingers in so many different pies as we understand the development model for our clients. Understanding, and not necessarily in depth, but understanding in some way many of the things on this list. So obviously we need to understand functional and desirable design, building codes, building technologies. Now we need to understand modern methods of construction, planning regulations, application processes, local politics. I'm no genius in local politics, but I do have to understand what's going on in order to make some reasonable recommendations for my clients as they make their business choices. We also need to understand real estate demand and pricing, construction constraints, practicalities to do with site access, material use, trades, financing constraints. We need to understand how our clients will get things built, what performance standards will they have to demonstrate to their banks in order to get construction financing, what taxes and fees or rebates thereof are going to be imposed or available, and that might affect the business model, and then also engineering impacts. Because we're in a position to see all of these pieces, we are able to, and I think have to play an important role in this moment of solving Canada's housing crisis. So it's important for us to first educate ourselves about what's possible and all of the moving pieces, to raise awareness amongst each other and outside of our industry, bringing people kind of up to speed about what's possible and what innovation can and should look like, and then offering solutions. So let's talk about some of those complex pieces and how they interact and how they inform design decisions and recommendations. The building code implications for this little niche of housing are pretty significant. Much of the building code that applies to these little buildings was written without these little buildings in mind at all. These kinds of multi-unit buildings, especially the ones with dedicated entrances, just not a lot of them throughout the history of our building code. And so when we apply building code, sometimes we find some little surprises or things that are just nonsensical, complications, particularly when we put in building permits and the codes examiners at municipalities interpret things differently. This is just a second floor plan from one of our projects. This is an 8-unit building with dedicated entrances. You'll see that there are 3 staircases. They are obviously all dedicated to an individual unit. Some of the code complexities that are at play here, issues around firewalls that divide groupings of units. So when we have more than 2 units on top of each other, grouped together on either side of a dividing wall, whether that is a firewall or not, it actually depends on the way in which the building is serviced based on the building code. The stairs themselves have an awful lot of complexity in the building code interpretation, depending on whether a stair leading up to an upper unit is leading up to a 2-story or 1-story upper unit. And that piece of the building code clearly wasn't written with this kind of typology in mind. The complexities in these designs on the outside to meet building code requirements for safe fire exiting we've always had these pieces of code. The traditional design for a stacked townhouse grew out of these pieces of code. But when we switch things up with these small buildings, it can be really challenging. So we have to keep in mind that doors need to be protected from windows nearby, that stairs need to be protected or distanced from windows nearby. And because these small buildings have so many doors and windows all the way around, to meet code requirements for daylighting on the inside, it can become really challenging. A challenge, but also an advantage in some ways. Much of the housing stock right across the country hasn't been particularly well designed or designed by architects. A lot of tract housing and housing that got slapped together without a lot of thought. This is our chance to put a lot of thought into it, because you can't satisfy building code without putting a lot of thought into it. We also find that many, if not almost all, of our small multi-unit building designs have a pathway that loops the building, allowing a safe path of travel around both sides of the building on the site. And that's something that is new to many established neighborhoods where buildings have only 1 or 2 units and there's just a path of travel straight out to the street and not this looping pathway. So lots of complexities with building code, lots to work through. Zoning, potentially an even bigger can of worms, depending on where you live and what zoning bylaw you're using. Zoning bylaws across Ontario have snowballed generally. Most municipalities have, over the last couple of decades, increased the word count in their zoning bylaw to scary proportions. The reason that zoning tends to snowball is because zoning is often written in a sense to prevent the worst case outcome. And so we laugh a little bit around my office about what that scary worst case outcome is that everybody's so afraid of and trying desperately to prevent by adding more and more and more words to zoning bylaws. And so we had some fun with AI and made this picture of what we think they might be trying to prevent. But when it comes to infill, a lot of zoning provisions are irrelevant and inappropriate. And so one of the things that I would really call all members of the OAA to speak to anytime you get the chance is the importance of simplifying zoning bylaws and making sure that zoning bylaws are actually appropriate in the way that they regulate. This image, for example, has the dreaded skinny building, too skinny to be reasonable. And there's quite a bit of zoning language right across the country that's written to prevent this. But as we all know, the building code already prevents this, right? Because the building code already requires exits, safe paths of travel, room area requirements. It's all covered, and no need to double dip and zone it out as well. So some examples of the complication and overreach and elaborate, unnecessary elaborateness of zoning. All sorts of bylaws have these minimum site areas, minimum lot widths. It's all in neighborhoods that already exist for infill lots that are already there, and to prevent narrow buildings that actually we can't build because the building code requires a certain amount of size of things. Okay, hang on. My slide deck is thinking. Sorry about that. Try again. Okay, well, we'll just look at it like that for a second. So another piece of zoning that works against us as architects is the very elaborate requirements that are worded with typology names. So these are some of the typology names that are used in bylaws across Ontario. And it's a long list. Different bylaws have different definitions for these typologies. And overall, they're quite unnecessary. It's time to just let go of that typology approach to zoning. And it's interesting to look at some of the multi-unit designs that are possible if we don't have those. And we had a little laugh naming them with new typology names. So this is a side-to-side fourplex. This is a side-to-side triplex with towns attached to the back. And this is a quadplex of duplexes. So to be serious about it for a moment, we should just let go of typology names. And that's an important piece of advocacy work for all of us in all our municipalities. We also need to be advocating for zoning that allows for more replication. So repeatable designs often don't happen within the environment of infill regulations because infill regulations result in custom solutions. We figure out exactly how much we can build under the zoning and we max it out. It is possible to write zoning so that repeatable designs have flexibility in the way that they're positioned on the site to respond to site context. And if our municipalities are serious about promoting repeatable design outcomes and making use of all of our modular potential in our industry, they do need to adjust their zoning bylaws so that zoning favors repetition instead of favoring custom solutions. When I say that to municipal planners, they often get a bit defensive. They don't intend to favor custom solutions. So it's not out of ill intent. It's the consequence of the way their side yard area FSI requirements are structured that results in a more viable business outcome for custom than for replication. So there are lots of other planning barriers that are direct and indirect that we all need to be aware of as we work to design these buildings for our clients. Parking is a really big one. So many municipalities have moved forward progressively in not requiring parking, allowing the market to dictate where parking is built, which is fantastic. That is as it should be, in my opinion. The trouble is, though, that many municipalities are not aware that parking is a necessary part of business models and that we really do need to be mindful of where that solution is going to land. There needs to be a solution for our clients to build housing. And so we've worked with municipalities to help them understand the potential for street permit parking, neighborhood parking lots, and how they manage with snow if they go with either of those solutions. We also face a lot of complexities around stormwater management right now. Municipalities across Ontario and Canada imposing advanced storage requirements on our small sites. We studied the impact of infill in Sudbury and discovered that if infill was moving at full speed, they would increase the hard surface in neighborhoods by 0.1% a year, which is a stormwater rounding error. So it's also important that we continue to advocate for simple solutions and not over design of engineering systems for our small sites. And that, of course, also extends to fire flow. So I like to describe the challenge here in moving these projects forward. Our municipal systems are very much like my grandmother's sewing basket, and it's a mess. And so with the Building In program, we're working with municipalities to provide a kind of a patch solution, an approach that doesn't try and fix all of the mess, but opens up the business opportunity for these innovative housing solutions in older neighborhoods. From the federal perspective, this is quite important. From a federal perspective, though, it's actually important that not just that municipalities clean up and allow for this kind of infill, but that they clean up in the same way so that modular factories can be producing product for multiple municipalities, multiple destinations. So it's important ultimately that we have some federal leadership on this front. So we're recommending a federal toolkit for municipalities so that they can have a unified approach to allow this innovation in housing. We're calling for a mapping methodology to target permissions. We've seen the sort of debacle of blanket rezonings and how upset people get. We have recommended some simple zoning to the federal government, but also for municipal use. But also we work with municipalities to help them to find simple ways, practical ways to zone. We know that we need building code interpretation memos so that when an innovative, replicable design is produced, we can be confident that it will be approved and that the plans examiner won't simply have a different code interpretation. And we need to pair these things up with parking solutions, practical civil engineering solutions that are neighborhood-wide and not burdensome on a single development. So I'm just going to skip forward a few slides. Okay, so educating ourselves, raising awareness, and offering solutions for all of these different pieces of the puzzle, because it's all important and it all matters. But let's talk right now for a bit about functional and desirable design and how that fits into this whole puzzle, how important it is. As opportunities open up, as zoning bylaws are adjusted, as building code interpretations become more firm and more clear, we as architects are going to be called upon to produce more repeatable designs. And so we need to be thoughtful about how we do our job well. So I'm going to look at just a few examples that we had handy around the office and talk about some features that we need to be considering as we move forward. One of the big advantages design elements that has surprisingly become pretty central to the work of my office. Because we work in the city of Ottawa, we've been working with them in a professional capacity on and off for about 8 years, helping them to advance their zoning bylaw, such that we're now in a position as architects to undertake multi-unit low-rise design that isn't possible in many other places of the country, across the country. So that's great for us. It has worked out well, but still so many more hills to climb here. So as a result, one of the design features that we find ourselves repeating a lot in the Ottawa area is a little switchback stair in a dedicated, in a building with dedicated entrances. We find ourselves also designing an awful lot of triplets of units. So this is an example of triplets of units. So 3 units in the front, 3 units in the back, and this very efficient little switchback stair. It's efficient because the basement unit enters and goes down underneath the stair to the second floor unit going up above. So it's very compact, no space is wasted, and yet every unit gets their own dedicated entrance. And we use this stair also for some 3-story designs. So this is an example. This is actually the front of a plan I showed you before. So part of a 8 or 9-plex building. But this little piece of it is a triplex with a unit in the basement with a side entry door, a unit on the ground floor. Sorry, it's just, yeah, sorry, there's the entrance door. Off of an entrance porch. It's just missing the porch. So ground floor unit. And then a second floor unit, also with a side entry up the flight of stairs, and it's a 2-story unit. And so also very efficient. Building code challenge here is that we need to have a balcony on that topmost floor, or we need to close off the stair at the second level and provide a door. We're going through the process now of an alternative solution for some of the performance standards for the stair under those circumstances, because it's a piece of the building code that's been written without this typology in mind. Accessibility is a big deal. It's really important that we infuse our neighborhoods with accessible units. So these are older neighborhoods that don't have generally any accessible units. And it's a challenge because of that balance between accessibility and affordability, and the challenge of making the business models work. In this example, all the dwelling units have a dedicated entrance, and the rear units, all the 1-bedroom units at the back have the potential to be fully accessible with a lift. The client would decide which units they would like to design as fully accessible. The others might be for aging in place. There's some variety and the ways that this could play out depending on lot grading as well, and the demand and target demographic in the neighborhood. So this design began with a challenge, actually, from a team member of ours who is a Danish architect and planner, who looked at many of our designs and was concerned about the narrow side yards. As the infill buildings get quite long and narrow on lots, and there are entrances down the side, quite rightly pointed out that these spaces are not desirable social spaces. And we see this quite a bit in some of the designs coming out of Edmonton right now. They're 8-plex designs where the side yards are pretty severe, and there's not enough space for social interaction. So as we think about these designs and prepare to repeat them, we need to be really thoughtful about their impact on the social dynamic of the neighborhood. On the street space facing facades, it's really important to have socially dynamic features, so porches and balconies, to make sure that the people who move into these buildings are perceived as neighbors and not as strangers. But when we get long, skinny buildings that take advantage of the depth of an infill lot, we need to be also conscious of the social dynamic as we move along down through side yards. This can be particularly challenging when our zoning bylaws set buildings with narrow side yards, and our developer clients are needing to yield and maximize their return in square footage. So one of the recommendations that we make, our planning team make to municipalities, is to have potential for a different side yard on those deep lots and buildings that go further back but have more space in sides. As architects, we also need to be looking for those opportunities to ensure that we're maximizing on that social portion of spaces and mindful about how people use spaces outside their entry doors. This building is also an example of that kind of kit of parts approach, where different pieces could be used differently on different sites. Right, so this is a 2-story variation, and this is a 3-story variation in the front. We've also designed this with a two-bedroom unit at the front instead of a 1-bedroom unit at the front. And in this design variation, there is a basement garage in the townhouse units. And these are larger units with a master suite on the top floor. Those are the site plans for those 2 variations. So you can see how differently it plays out, even though there's repetition in the design elements. So our ideal would be a future Canada where municipalities have similar zoning requirements for these kinds of buildings in targeted neighborhoods, such that a modular producer of these pieces could be delivering to different municipalities and to different sites, sending different pieces depending on the site layout and the building height of the neighborhood and that kind of thing. So these were the 3-story examples that I showed you. These ones have dedicated entrances. They have shared entrances and shared front doors, shared exit doors, shared stairways, and very small amounts of shared hallway inside. For the low-rise developer who is building to retain rental product, it means an added cost for long-term maintenance. So there's a disadvantage to that shared piece, but when you yield a 3-story building with as many as 12 units in it, it pays off. So these are 12-unit examples, these buildings. Here in Ottawa, we've been advocating for quite a long time for this 12-unit maximum. 12 units in which no site plan application is required. And yay, we have gotten there now. It's great for Ottawa, it's great for our developers here, and it's really something that should be happening right across the country. So 12 units with no site plan application. It permitted only in our N4 or old R4, now N4 zones. And it's a great opportunity for developer builders. Again, parking is a big challenge here. So parking isn't required, but of course, most of our builders can't get the business model working without a certain proportion of parking. So the design on the top does include parking at the rear that tucks under the building, whereas the design at the bottom doesn't have any on-site parking. One of the innovations that we've had to apply in these buildings has to do with that unit count. When these were first designed, the 12-unit permission wasn't in place yet. There were only 10 units permitted. And I was in a position where I had to tell my clients that the building was big enough for 12 units. It worked great with 12 units. They couldn't have 12 units unless they were prepared to go through a site plan application process, which of course is wildly cost prohibitive. But that it was a pity to waste space, to not build to maximum potential. And so we designed these buildings for them to convert one day to 12 units. So this is one of the plans. I've highlighted this back unit. This unit was designed to convert easily later. And we were delightfully surprised that later came during our construction period. So it's already been converted mid-construction. So there it is as 2 units. I know that that's not flashy innovation, but I think it's really important innovation in the context of all of our municipal constraints right now. It's important for us to be thoughtful in how we maximize the potential, development potential for our clients, and that maximize the housing potential for our municipalities. And by the way, we did do this work open book with the city. We weren't pretending that we weren't preparing for additional units, but we were committed to sticking to 10-unit buildings until the regulations changed, and then we were just happy that the regulations changed so quickly. So the potential for this kind of housing across Canada is actually immense. We've measured the municipal areas, the population growth, the size of the existing older neighborhoods across the country, and there is enough potential through redevelopment at relatively low pace of redevelopment. So one lot out of every 100 might redevelop per year in a hot neighborhood. At that kind of pace, there's enough land supply in those existing neighborhoods to supply our low-rise housing need in Canada for 20 or 30 years, no problem. So immense capacity. That's not to say that should be the only way we supply low-rise housing in Canada, but just to give you an order of magnitude here of how much potential there is in our older neighborhoods. And those are all older neighborhoods that are a fiscal drain and would become a fiscal advantage to their municipalities if they had this kind of infill. Those are all neighborhoods that would become better environmentally with that kind of increase in density. So to be clear, emissions would increase, but average household emissions would fall as a result of that kind of influx of density. And then finally, when we intensify our neighborhoods, it is an opportunity for those neighborhoods to evolve, to attract more small shops, to justify more public investment, increased transit. There's more potential for people to be using walking and biking paths, so a greater diversity of travel paths. The neighborhood has the potential to pass that tipping point and become a compact and complete community. So looking back over my little wish list of what innovation could be for repeatable low-rise housing, this multi-unit low-rise niche is really important. It's important for Canada. It's important for us as architects. It doesn't make it on the cover of magazines very often, but I think that it's essential that we as a community take this niche really seriously and push really hard to see it move forward. My office is continuing work with municipalities, and if you know of or work in a municipality that you think could benefit from some infill housing market forecasting or zoning recommendations, then please connect us. It would be really great to expand our services to more municipalities across the province and across the country. And that's the end of my presentation. I understand that we're going to open now to some questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Rosaline, for that really excellent presentation. As she mentioned, we are going to open now for the Q&A. So if you do have questions, all of our attendees, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box below. We do already have quite a few questions ready to go, which is great. So the first one I see here is in reference to the pie chart that you showed, I think, towards the beginning of the presentation. So someone has asked whether the 70% low-rise urban housing that you mentioned, whether that includes suburban housing as well.
Yes, it does. It does. And that's based on Stats Canada data from 2021, I think.
Great. Okay. So here's a really interesting question. So this person has asked, are there any tips for handling NIMBYism and anti-urbanist city councils who are often the nail in the coffin for this type of infill development?
Yeah, so with city councilors, our experience is that the thing that they kind of wake up and listen to is tax uplift. So we often provide not just our housing, our mapped housing outcomes, also the emissions housing outcome, and then a fiscal outcome. So you can see the tax uplift mapped across geographic areas, and that seems to wake them up to the advantage of infill. So money talks there. They aren't actually grabbed that much by the emissions mapping in comparison, which is kind of too bad. But yeah, definitely the fiscal mapping, it registers. Also, there is an interest in housing diversity amongst municipal leaders, and infill that can provide diversity, so different tenures, different unit sizes, and still have the family size housing that everybody's talking about. That seems to resonate.
Great, thank you. So we have a question here about the OBC updates, or whether there are OBC updates in the pipeline to allow single-stair developments beyond 2 stories.
It's hard to predict exactly because the housing industry is terrified by the idea of more changes to the building code. And so there's a bit of a movement afoot to put some brakes on changes to the building code. However, we are in a position already for alternate solutions. So it's worth working with your local planning departments and local municipal leaders to advance the idea of those alternate solutions so that we can move things forward more quickly right now.
Okay. We have a question here around heritage issues. So this person has said the heritage issues are significant in establishing fit in these older neighborhoods, and they're wondering if you can comment on that.
Yeah. Well, when we work with municipalities to help them find areas ideal for infill, we actually steer them away from heritage neighborhoods. Because heritage regulations and processes are so complex, it compromises business models to such a degree that it doesn't really work. And so it's kind of a different can of worms. We can meet our housing targets and come up with really great innovative housing solutions in neighborhoods that are just kind of basic, you know, roads and streets and houses, no heritage value, nothing quite special happening. And so I think it's best just to focus on that low-hanging fruit.
Okay. Someone has asked here, how noise transmission is treated in all these units, vertically and horizontally?
Ooh, that's too big of a question.
Oh,
So much detail. Okay, so it is really important to get your detailing right. And equally important that is built right, right? It's a bit fiddly on site. So attention to detail on site is equally important.
okay. Um, So, a question around costs. I'm not sure if you can be specific in your answer, but maybe you can comment on kind of the general question. So this person has said, how much does it cost in dollar per square foot to build in Toronto and Ottawa, if you can divulge that? And how do you base your fee as a percentage? And then what percent? And then they go on to say, most of the public thinks that they can get house plans from, say, House and Garden for $600. Most architects are not interested in residential design because there is no money in it except for apartments. So I wonder if you have any comments on that.
So we at my office make a lot more for our mid and high rise designs than we do for missing middle work. We continue to do it because we have a heart for it. A lot of architectural offices can't make a go of that. But it is work primarily for developer clients. So it's not for the person who might choose a design out of a House and Garden magazine. That's a different category of housing. Um, and for developer clients who have found this niche and can make a go of it business wise, we add a lot of value. So we don't charge per square foot, we charge per project. It's a lot harder work for us than to design and to draft than a single or a semi because it's so detailed. It is as complicated as our tower drawings and tower designs. And people generally don't appreciate that, but you do have to just charge fixed fees in proportion roughly to the challenge and the amount of work that's involved. Developers who have built these kinds of buildings do appreciate that a good set of drawings are important and that they can maximize their return if they have a good design.
Okay. I have a question here. So as I see these infill designs, I'm wondering how the code requirement for limiting distance between combustible buildings is being dealt with.
Very carefully. So some of our buildings do have steel studs on the sidewalls. And some of our buildings are further from the side lot line than is required by zoning in order to avoid steel studs. There is, when I put up that slide about the larger side yard and the need for social spaces in side yards leading to front doors, that that agenda actually aligns well with the challenge of allowable openings and side yards, right? So the two purposes work together, and I think what's important when planners think about how to regulate these kinds of buildings, they need to be mindful that these limiting distance design pieces are in play and give us wiggle room to work with, as opposed to being very, very stringent in their zoning. Wiggle room is important, but being very strategic, keeping windows on the side limited, and maximizing our front and back glazing is, pretty fundamental.
Mm. Okay, thank you. We have a question here. Do you use prefabricated products for construction?
Yes, all sorts, panelized. We've got some projects that hopefully will move ahead now with volumetric, but absolutely, increasingly so. And we see developers in the Ottawa and surrounding areas dabbling with different kinds of modular products, different panelized products. And there's always new things coming onto the market these days.
Mm. Um, Someone's asked here, how is the overall status of infrastructure for this approach of increasing density? Is the city prepared to increase according to the current capacity of infrastructure like sewage system or electricity supply?
Okay, so sewage, yes, capacity issues need to be, or capacity needs to be measured and calculated. Many older neighborhoods were designed to higher capacities than they now house. And so that's an advantage. We should be using up that capacity before we build more. So it's an advantage to build in those older neighborhoods that have latent capacity. There are capacity issues around sewage, though, that specifically relate to infill, because neighborhoods that were constructed with combined sewers and then those were replaced with separated sewers. Older homes in that neighborhood are still putting their stormwater into the sanitary. And so by replacing an old house in one of those neighborhoods with infill and hooking it up properly to the storm and sanitary, it actually reduces the burden on the sanitary. So there are a lot of pieces at play there. Overall, generally, a huge benefit to intensify rather than to expand. And cities are going to have a clear sense of their infrastructure challenge. In order to get on top of infrastructure, the first thing cities need are projections. So forecasts of how much housing they're going to get so that they can plan for it. Forget, what was the second part of that question?
They also
Infrastructure
asked about
and
electricity supply.
Oh, electricity. Yeah. Electricity is a big can of worms, particularly because of the shift to electric cars. So no municipality across Ontario has enough power for the electric cars that we all aspire to. So big problem right there. I don't know who's on that, but I surely hope someone is. When it comes to our infill developments, we face all sorts of challenges dealing with different hydro providers who manage supply differently and have different strange and unusual rules that haven't taken these multi-unit buildings into consideration. And so it's definitely a challenge that sadly has to be addressed one provider at a time. So it's not a challenge that is unified across the province.
Mm. Okay. Um, Someone here said, first of all, a very interesting presentation. Many thanks. And then they go on to say, what I see here is working with municipalities and the flexibility on the zoning allowed innovative designs. I am based in Toronto. Any tips for working with larger, more strict municipalities and how to engage with the planning to get similar results?
That is a tricky one because you do have some very good people already engaging with planning and you're not making much headway. We have mapped the basic, like the neighborhoods that I've described, the ones that they're easy, just roads and streets and houses. We have mapped those older neighborhoods in Toronto, and you have immense capacity for this kind of infill. Um, Obviously not in the neighborhoods that are already tightly packed. So you've got lots of older neighborhoods with very narrow lots, and it's quite intense, and people have renovated those little semis already. That's not a good environment for infill, but you've got an awful lot of neighborhood area that's just got singles, even entire neighborhoods of bungalows in Toronto. People outside, we do not think of you as bungalow area, but in central Toronto, not including the greater Toronto areas, you've got lots of bungalow neighborhoods. Those are prime for this kind of infill redevelopment, and I'm not sure how to get the message through. But I do hope we get there soon because it's just a pity. So much potential.
Hmm. Okay, great. We have a question here. So does the architect need engineers' foundation plan for these projects, or can they do the whole thing themselves? Two-part question. And also, what progress has been made with the OBC in that regard?
Oh, I don't have answers to that. Sorry.
That's okay. Um, okay, so the next question here, have you made any representations to the provincial government, in brackets, building code program, regarding potential code changes or provincially prepared opinions regarding innovative housing forms?
No, but we are hoping to engage around the opinions piece. A lot of the challenges we face are simply interpretation, not the code itself, but just the interpretation of it. And so we're hoping to engage at that level. When it comes to code changes, it's a tricky one because the industry is so off kilter right now, reeling from recent changes. So it's kind of hard to know where that falls. One code change, though, that would be very simple and really very useful. There is in Ontario code, the code prevents services from running under the slab of one unit to another unit, which on many of these little designs would be the ideal way to service the building. And under the national code, that isn't prohibited. So that's one little piece that I would dearly love to see and wouldn't upset anyone. But it's a tricky time to talk about code changes.
Hmm, okay. Someone here has asked, is there any tie into or intent to tie into CMHC apartment construction loan program? If this is not, oh, they're asking if that's a relevant question to your content.
Yeah, so all of our projects that fall into this category of multi-unit low rise, all of our clients are using the CMHC MLI Select Mortgage Certificate Program.
Mm.
And they are also almost all avoiding or getting the GST rebate. So those programs are critical to the business model.
Mm. Okay. Um, Someone has asked, what type of construction do you see most of these buildings being constructed with? Wood, steel, or a combination of the two?
Wood.
Mostly wood.
Yeah, they're mostly wood buildings.
Okay. Um, Someone has asked, what are the ideal dimensions of a factory manufactured modular unit? It's quite a specific question, but they've asked, could two modules be side to side to form a single unit at 7 meters overall width? Very specific numbers there, but
Very specific numbers. Okay, well, I won't go into the specific numbers, but there are standard numbers. They vary depending on delivery radius and which factory you're receiving your delivery from. There's width limitations. There are also length limitations. So you need to talk specifically to the factory that you're planning to work with about what their limitations are. There are also limitations with respect to just the function of getting the modules onto your particular site, whether you're going under or over wires, whether the load needs to pass under bridges, all those things. So talk to the factory near you. Obviously, there's a big difference then in the challenge between volumetric modular and panelized modular. So if you're just bringing flat panels or flat packs to the site, there's much more flexibility in what you can do. Um, and yeah, I think got to talk to the factory.
Great. Someone has asked, do any of the designs or prototypes allow for private outdoor space for the residents, i.e. backyards, etc.? I understand this is a big draw for the demographic that are drawn to low-rise typology.
Yes. So when we're recommending zoning to our municipal clients, we recommend 30% soft surface on every infill site. And because of that requirement, you don't end up with parking in the rear yard. It's pretty much the building, the paths, and the landscaping. And so that landscape area is then free for recreation. The buildings with dedicated entrances particularly would attract residents who enjoy the outdoor space around the building. It's shared space, obviously, but it's still really important. On top of that, just landscape space to use, though, porches and balconies and terraces are really important, particularly on the front facade, in order to have that social dynamic.
Okay. Someone's asked, does this type of project require a subdivision? Do deep units require presenting an easement within the property?
So sometimes, but it depends on the ownership structure. So if the building is a rental, then no, it's all under one ownership. If you have like that design that I showed that had a triplex attached to a triplex with townhouses on the back, that can be severed into multiple pieces. So each triplex could be individually owned in the front and then serviced straight from the street. So that's a simple severance to establish those ownerships. The townhouses down the back would need to be serviced separately with a flag lot configuration in order to have servicing underground. And it depends on what's permitted in your municipality, whether there is an easement required for services and there are joint services, or whether you need to divvy up the ownership and have multiple services coming in. So it's specific to your municipality. It can also be specific to the context and obviously the orientation of the lot, what's possible. One option that I hope will become viable in the future would be also to create a condominium structure for these buildings. They're too small in Ontario for that to be cost effective. However, multiple buildings in close proximity could be under one condominium structure. And then it simplifies the servicing and the severing as opposed to trying to make things freehold or owned in triplets of units. Right now, the condo idea is not a fly. It's not something anybody's interested in right now, but presumably in the future that there will be a growing interest once again as things wax and wane, right? In condos again. And so in the future, that ownership potential would be interesting.
Okay. Someone has asked about heating in the units. How are you heating with electric heat and I assume with AC? And then are you using split system heat pumps?
So it varies a lot depending on the developer's choice. The decisions are made based primarily on two things. How to use as little space as possible for mechanical systems because the units are small. Oh no, there's three things. How to qualify for MLI Select financing and how to manage limited hydro loads. So it's easy to just go all electric. until hydro says they won't give you that much power. They refuse to give you 2 hits, one to each side of the building, and things get more complicated. Sometimes our developers simply choose to go with gas so that they can reduce their hydro load.
Okay. Sorry, we have a question here. Could you achieve a 4-story multi-unit with interior rated stair core and two-story upper units with the exit to the stair at the uppermost level and second exit to a 3-story balcony?
Okay, read it again.
So yeah. So could you achieve a 4-story multi-unit with interior rated stair core and 2-story upper units with the exit to the stair at the uppermost level and second exit to a 3-story balcony? A lot of moving
Yes,
parts there, but
yes. I think if I understand the question correctly, that would be a yes.
okay. Great. Um, we have a question about condominiumization, which I think you sort of referred to already, but they asked as a follow-up, if you had experience with condominiumization of multi-units to be sold independently, and how was market success? I don't know if there's-
So, yes, I have, but not recently because it's not a market success right now.
Mm,
Um, yeah. So that's a bit unfortunate right now to be constrained that way. But then again, there is a shortage of rental supply in most markets across Ontario. So the demand for small buildings to be owned as rental as sort of investment property and rented, there's quite a demand for that. So for now, that's what these small buildings are. In the
mm,
future, maybe they could be built as condos.
mm. Okay. Someone has asked here, in terms of urban design, North American cities are designed based on the car. But with these types of housing designs, are we going to expect changes in other buildings, for example, retail offices, in terms of locations, zoning, and etc. as well?
So it's really in the hands of our urban planners, our city planners. Um, when we intensify neighborhoods, it creates a great opportunity to transition those neighborhoods into complete communities with small shops that you can walk to. It's not going to happen if our regulations stay as they are now, strongly favoring the business model of big shops with parking lots.
Mm,
So long as that is the by far better business opportunity for the person who wants to own a commercial facility, we won't get the smaller commercial facilities close to neighborhoods. Um, so just another thing for us to lend our voice to. Municipal planners are just gonna have to stop doing that. I think many don't realize how powerful they are in guiding commercial development to car-centric solutions and how possible it is to balance that out so that it's possible, and as neighborhoods intensify, more likely that people would gravitate to building and opening smaller walkable destinations.
mm. Right. Okay. Um, Someone has asked, have you looked into any of these being housing co-ops instead of rental, freehold, or condos?
Yes, and we do have um, some groups together with some developers looking into that right now. Co-op funding is targeted right now to bigger buildings, which is a problem. And co-op funding is about to dry up, I've been told. So that's obviously not very helpful. But they certainly would be well suited, especially if there was a peppering of these buildings throughout a neighborhood. All of those could be under one co-op umbrella.
Mm, okay. And we have just one question left, but if there's any last minute questions, if you're still typing your question in the Q&A box, please still go ahead. This last question asks, at 4 stories, the code calls for an elevator and sprinkler system, correct? And then they follow up, also, I don't see 10% accessible units.
So just back to the story thing. we need to keep in mind just the definitions of stories. So the previous question about 4 stories with a stair, I'm not sure how many stories that question had. We need to be mindful of when we cross over from part 9 of the building code into part 3 of the building code. And there's all of our designs have sunny half basements, we call them. Some of them are hardly even basements. They're only just sunken into the ground 2 or 3 feet. But according to building code, it's a basement, making the stories above counting, not including that living level. And so we exceed part 9 of the building code once we've exceeded 3 stories based on that definition of basement. So most of these designs are only viable business models when they stay within part 9 of the building code. I know there are lots of places, particularly in Toronto, where that's not true. Busy streets in particular, the numbers can work out okay for going taller and building under part 3 with sprinklers and higher levels of lateral stability. But within neighborhoods, it makes sense to stay within part 9 and to not go to a 4th story above grade. I've forgotten the question now. Did I answer the question?
I believe so. Well, they asked about elevators and sprinkler systems if it's a 4-story
Right.
unit. And then they also asked about the 10% accessible units.
Right. So it's 15%. However, accessible units aren't required for townhouse style buildings. So depending on the way the building is structured, your local housing plans examiner may interpret the trigger differently for accessibility. Also worth an interpretation memo that we all agree about. But for example, if you've got a row of townhouses and each townhouse is a triplex of units, so triplex, there would be a difference of opinion about whether that triggers the requirement for accessibility or not. Assuming that it does, the threshold for accessible units is at 7 units. And then you're going to need 15% accessible units. And it's challenging for these small buildings, obviously, but there are different options. So we have some designs with a lift outside, some designs with a lift inside, so that you get in the door and then you have a lift for a half story. And then occasionally we have a 12-unit building that includes an elevator. We even had a 4-unit building that included an elevator, but that was for a dedicated co-housing use.
Okay. We've had a few more questions come in, so hopefully we can get through these by the end of our webinar today. So someone has said here, in Toronto, some areas currently permit up to 6 dwelling units, a sixplex, and are eligible for development charges, DC exemptions. If a future owner were to apply for condominium registration and sell each unit individually, would development charges need to be paid at the time of sale? The first part of the question. And then for your multiplex project, have you designed a shared/common mechanical or utility room to accommodate water and electrical meters? So I guess two separate questions there.
Okay, so for the condo thing, a 6-unit condo just isn't a good idea. It's very cost prohibitive. So if cost is of no significance to you whatsoever, then I guess go ahead. And I don't have an answer to your question about the DCs. You'd have to check with your building department, but it seems unlikely to me that they would have a mechanism with which to receive that payment because you've already built your building, by the sounds of it. But yeah, it's the yearly cost to maintain a condominium structure doesn't really pay off until you've got 15 or 20 units. What was the second half of the question?
The second half was for your multiplex project, have you designed a shared/common mechanical or utility room to accommodate water and electrical meters?
Yes, so different variations on that. The buildings with shared entrances and exits all have a shared mechanical room for sure. Those with dedicated entrances often they usually, almost always have dedicated mechanical space in each unit. And then there's a water entry point that is to the benefit of all, but built within one unit under a stair usually. Yeah, so the challenge is always just keeping it tight and compact.
Mm. Okay. So just a few more questions. Someone has said here, infills change the nature of neighborhoods and affect residents that bought into a low-rise, less dense residential area. How are existing houses remaining affected in terms of sun or shade, wind, light pollution, privacy, etc.?
Yeah, so I think the important thing is that they're affected in the same way with this kind of infill, in the same way that they're affected today with today's infill. Today's infill is at low densities. This kind of innovation is at mid densities and comes with a whole lot of advantages. And without the building being any bigger, right? So it's not changing the way that infill affects the physical surrounding and shade and sun and that kind of thing. It's the same. Um, However, when we recommend to municipalities zoning to support this kind of infill, we are also recommending facade zoning. We're recommending that two-story neighborhoods continue to be 2 stories, 3-story neighborhoods continue to be 3 stories. You can double or triple the densities without increasing the heights of the neighborhoods. And the facade zoning is important to make sure that facades are not big and blank, that they're a good fit for the neighborhood, that they have interest, windows, doors, balconies, porches, active spaces. Yeah, because that's important. They do need to be a good fit.
Mm, right. Okay. And last question, regarding your future flexibility proposal to split a larger unit, could something similar be achieved with a two-story unit by closing the stair? Would this require upgraded fire separation or considered a rented portion of the original fire compartmentalized unit?
Could be either way. I think the important thing is if you're doing a new build and you have a kind of a before and after scenario in mind, to make sure that you're building it so that the after scenario meets building code and has the right fire protections already built in from the beginning, so that your renovation is really simple.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks, everyone, all of our attendees, for those really great questions. I have just a few closing announcements, but first, of course, want to thank Rosaline for this really excellent, thorough presentation and for this great discussion today. And again, thanks to everyone who attended and submitted your questions for our speaker. As we conclude this webinar, again, just a few quick announcements. For those who are seeking continuing education learning hours, the OAA will record your participation in this webinar on your OAA transcript, so there is no need for individual reporting on your part. We just kindly ask for your patience at this busy time of year as we process and confirm the accreditation of your hours within the next few weeks. All attendees will soon receive a link to a survey to submit your feedback for today's webinar, which we and our presenters highly value. So please do complete the survey when you get a chance. And finally, our next webinar takes place tomorrow, Thursday, March 26th, with the title Understanding the OAA Complaints Process and Professional Misconduct. And this one is hosted by our Deputy Registrar, Claire Hepburn, as well as the present and former chairs of the OAA Complaints Committee, Ishan Patel and Tone Dreesen. So please do check that one out as well. If you're looking for additional ways to get your Con Ed hours before end of cycle, be sure to check out the Con Ed opportunities page on the OAA website, where we list continuing education opportunities offered by other organizations beyond the OAA. And with that, I thank Rosaline again for being with us here today. Thank you all for your attendance and have a pleasant remainder of your day. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Shalika.